Hello Algebra 1A students, this is the video on ordering rational and irrational numbers. Today in class we talked about taking numbers and putting them in order from least to greatest. We made ourselves a number line and we did a worksheet. So if you don't remember, if you're confused on something, this video can help you to understand a little bit better and finish your homework. So your homework asks you to graph a set of numbers on the number line. So I have asked you to graph -2, 11, 5, -1.2, square root of 8, and 7/8. Now, when I say I want you to graph, that means I want you to make a dot. So whatever the number is, make a dot wherever that number is, and then I want you to label the dot. It is really important that you label the dot, because if you don't, I have no idea which of these numbers you're talking about. So we are going to do these 5 numbers together, and hopefully that will help you understand a little bit better. So let's start with -2, and that one's going to be in green. -2 is an integer, and we have an integer number line here, so it's really easy to place. So -1, -2, I'm going to take a nice big dot, put that on the -2, and label it -2. Easy. Okay. Let's take a look at 11/5. So 11/5 is a fraction. We could turn it into a decimal by taking 11 and dividing it by 5 and doing all that stuff. But there's an easier way to do it. Okay, we can compare it to fractions that turn into integers. So if you think about it, well, we kind of want a number that's close to 11 that 5 goes into real evenly. What about 10? So 10/5 would be what? 10/5 is 2, because 10 divided by 5 is 2. So it's close to 2. We know it's going to be close around this area. So our question then is it a little bit bigger or is it a little bit smaller? Well, 10 divided by 5 is 2. 11 is a little bit bigger than 10, which means 11 divided by 5 is going to be a little bit bigger because you have more stuff to divide, right? You have 11 things to divide instead of 10. So we know that it's going to be a little greater than 10/5, which means it's going to be a little bit bigger than 2. So we can go to 2 and say, I'm going to think it's a little bit around here, 11/5. And you know what? That's totally fine. You don't actually have to do this out and say, okay, well, this is going to be 2 times 10, and then 1, and then 2, it's about 2.2. You do not have to do that. You can give me an estimate, okay? This is maybe a little bit more work, might be with other numbers. It's okay for you to just relate it to a number that divides nicely, okay? And in fact, I suggest that you do because it'll be quicker. All right, now let's look at -1.2. This one's nice because we know -1.2 is going to be somewhere around -1, right? It's close to -1. But we got to think, okay, is it going to be on the left or on the right? So when we look at the number line, this is going greater, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if we were looking here, 1.2 would be right here, right here. But remember that it's kind of reflected when you go to the negatives, right? -1.2 is not right here, and in fact this is a fraction, right? Here's 1/2. This is going to be -0.001, -0.1, -0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. -1.2 is going to be on the other side of this, right? Because here it's in between 1 and 2. Well, this is going to be in between -1 and -2. So we know it's going to go a little bit to the left. We can kind of make a guesstimate and label it -1.2. Okay. Again, remember it's kind of like a reflection across that 0 point. All right, so let's look at square root of 8. Square roots are really interesting because some of them turn out to be whole numbers, like square root of 16 is 4, because 4 times 4 equals 16. And some of them, like square root of 2, are irrational, which means they go on and on and on forever. You cannot write them as a fraction. So square root of 8, well, there aren't really two numbers that you can multiply by itself to get 8, because 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16. But we can relate it to square roots that do come out nicely. So let's think of a square root that's close to 8, a number that's close to 8 that we know the square root of. Well, the square root of 9, we know the square root of 9 is 3, right? Because 3 times 3 is 9. Well, if square root of 9 is 3, we know that square root of 8 is going to be somewhere around 3. But again, we have to make that decision. Is it going to go on the left? Is it going to be between 2 and 3? Or going to be between 3 and 4? Well, square root of 8, 8 is a smaller number than 9, okay? So that means that if we're taking the square root, it's going to take a smaller number to multiply. So we know that square root of 8 is going to be smaller than square root of 9, which means it's going to be smaller than 3. So a little bit under 3, we're going to put a dot and label it square root of 8. Again, I didn't have to do any division, anything like that, any guessing. All I had to do was kind of relate it to something I already knew. The last one we're going to look at, let me find the color I haven't used here yet, is it pink, is 7/8. So 7/8 is a fraction, it's not a decimal. We could take 7 divided by 8 and do all that stuff, or we could relate it to a number that divides nicely. So let's see, what number divides nicely that's close to 8? So divides nicely by 8, that's close to 8. Well, what about 8? So 8 over 8, 8 divided by 8 is 1. So we know that 7/8, well, 7 is a little bit smaller than 8, so this is going to be a little bit smaller than 8 over 8, which means 7/8 is going to be a little bit smaller than 1. So here's 1, a little bit smaller, a little bit to the left is 7/8. Okay? The moral of the story here is relate it, let's say compare it, I like that better. Compare it to something you know. Compare it to something you know. Always compare it to something you know. That could be a fraction that divides nicely. It could be a square root. It could be 1/2. Okay, if you were trying to do, let's say you were trying to do 1.5 half, right? You related to a half or something like that. You really, really want to relate it to something you know because it makes your life easier. You don't have to do any division. You don't have to do anything in your calculator. You just have to relate it. So, other questions, bring to me tomorrow or come to office hours.